Backwards compatibility is a problem. Let's look at the hard facts. Do people value it? And if so, how much? Is it a selling point? And if so, for how long? Do Nintendo make significant income from backwards compatible titles? And what is the cost to them and the consumer of offering this feature? What is their philosophy of backwards compatibility? And moreover, what kind of backwards compatibility might Nintendo offer on the next system? Yes, it's time for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive. Let's start from Nintendo's own stated broad principles. Satoru Iwata voiced his view in a 2012 Investors Q&A about the importance of compatibility. He set out his views as follows. With regard to the backward compatibility with Wii, of the Wii U, we think that product compatibility is a very important element during the transitional period from one platform to another. The software lineup for a new platform is not very rich during such a period, and many customers do not want to throw away the software they bought for the previous platform. There are many Wii software titles that are still enjoyable, and when you have never played a game, you can enjoy it as nothing but a newly released game. We would therefore like to take advantage of business opportunities to sell software for a previous console. Now, while this is a laudable aim, Nintendo experiments with its consoles, and it's not unprecedented to try some features in one generation and discontinue them in the next. Analog triggers haven't returned since GameCube, double screen functionality went out with the shift to Switch, and many people never really use stereoscopic 3D, even on the 3DS. Offering backwards compatibility is always tricky to some degree if the hardware is substantially different, but Nintendo has confirmed their aim to have a smooth transition, and there is a widespread expectation that backwards compatibility will be offered. Certainly, when there isn't a major technological shift, precedent is on the side of a full-fledged backwards compatibility solution from Nintendo. The Game Boy Color supported Game Boy titles. The Game Boy Advance supported both Game Boy and Game Boy Color titles, meaning that in 2004 you could play a current console that still supported games released at the end of the 1980s, an incredibly pro-consumer option, and I must say something I took full advantage of in the 2000s, even though I still had both my Game Boy and my Color and would use both from time to time. It's true that console compatibility wasn't always offered, but I don't hold this against Nintendo. The Famicom, Super Famicom and N64 all used drastically different cartridge sizes and were technologically very different, and the fact is that none of the major cartridge-based systems offered backwards compatibility innately during this period. Once they moved over to disc systems, the GameCube was playable on Wii, and Wii games were playable on Wii U. The DS also played Game Boy Advance titles, and I think the lesson here is that generally speaking Nintendo is pro backward compatibility and wants to offer it to consumers where it makes sense. It seems on the surface to be a positive move for all involved. Nintendo get to keep selling old games and consumers get to access all titles, but there are some significant complexities involved. Firstly, backwards compatibility offers just another security loophole for people to exploit, and especially in the early life of a console, before a broad player base has been established, the battle against piracy is paramount for Nintendo's business strategy. Secondly, they explicitly see this as a sales tool. In a 2014 presentation to explain their digital strategy, they explained, "We tried to encourage consumers to upgrade from an existing handheld device to a new handheld device, or from an existing console to a new console by providing backwards compatibility that enabled them to take their software assets from their existing system." Thirdly, anything that extends the lifespan of the original hardware means that people are likely to buy games for the original as opposed to the newer hardware. And while you may think a sale is a sale is a sale, readying games for aging hardware has an additional cost for testing. Koshiota, the senior executive officer from the technology department division, explains, "We have to make sure that all new software being released works properly on the hardware, no matter what hardware version. Lot check is the process of actually checking if new software works on the numerous versions of hardware that are out there due to improvements being made. It's a big problem if it doesn't work on even one version. This is, of course, worth it if the sales numbers are significant, but how many people really stick with aging hardware? Let's dive in to the numbers. We're going back to the end of the 2012 fiscal year, the 3DS's first full year on the market, although not an incredibly auspicious start for them. The 3DS had sold 13.53 million units compared to the Nintendo DS's 5.1 million. However, in terms of software, the difference was very marked, with 36 million units of 3DS software shifting compared to the DS's 60.82 million. By the end of the 2012 to 2013 fiscal year, DS sales had dropped to 2.35 million hardware units and 33.38 million software units, despite the surprising release of Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 on the existing hardware. Still, even in its second year, the 3DS's 13.95 million hardware units and 49.61 million software units show that, particularly in software terms, the original DS accounted for about 40% of handheld software sold that year. In the 3DS's third year, hardware sales were about 12.24 million and software sales a healthier 67.89 million, but the DS still sold 0.13 million consoles and shifted 10.29 million software units, about 13% of handheld sales. All this is by way of illustrating that even once hardware sales transition, sales from a successful existing console's games can be a great stream of revenue, and allowing an avenue of backwards compatibility potentially opens up the current market to these older titles. But do people actually play the older games once they transition? Everyone says they want backwards compatibility, but don't most players stick to their current libraries? Microsoft looked into this in 2017 and concluded that for Xbox One players, an estimated 1.5% of 1.6 billion minutes usage time was spent on 360 games. However, breaking this down by minutes of time could be somewhat misleading. It stands to reason that the most intense players play the most, and so they are more likely to be playing newer games. The question is, how many people actually use the feature? GameBiz in 2017 concluded that 50% of players did. Given the vast install base of the Switch, it's likely to be an even higher number who would play Switch games. Certainly people self-reported as playing games on older systems, and I would imagine that the more tech-focused Xbox consumers might be somewhat more willing to make the technological jump than a good chunk of Nintendo's base. UK-based polling firm YouGov identified in 2022 that 45% of Switch gamers identified as casual players compared to 32% on PlayStation 5 and 36% on Xbox. That may simply be because of the larger install base on the Switch, meaning that casual players have had more time to adopt the system. After all, PC has the most casual gamers of all, but even so, it's likely that the casual audience would account for a long tail of sales for older titles, even if they aren't on the most current hardware. A great inducement for Nintendo to keep supporting the Switch. Another instructive piece of polling from YouGov from the launch window of the Nintendo Switch OLED model asked how many people would be likely to purchase an upgraded model. For all gamers, the percentage was 50% in America and 25% in Great Britain, compared to 40% of Switch or Switch Lite users in the USA and just 30% in Britain. Clearly, a generational leap is a much bigger deal for consumers than anything the OLED model, lovely though it was, could offer. But it gives a sense of the inertia in the core audience if less than half of the consumer base on the Switch already were desperate to upgrade. Similar proportionate levels of interest were shown around the launch of the PS5 and Xbox Series X. Around half of people were interested in early adopting, even though this was a generational leap at this point. Still, even if backwards compatibility is in demand, it doesn't necessarily mean that it aids the transition. In 2014, Nintendo noticed that despite backwards compatibility, we became disconnected with our consumers with the launch of each new device, as we could only form device-based relationships. This is significant alongside the launch of Nintendo systems to radically expand and develop the company's online infrastructure. Check out this video here for a deep dive on that front. If Nintendo looks to tie compatibility to accounts as opposed to consoles, what does this mean for physical gamers? Could we see a lot more gatekeeping by Nintendo of which games can be safely migrated and which ones need to be purchased again, possibly at a higher price tag, to cover the cost of the new funky mode? Modern Vintage Gamer's excellent exploration of this in March 2023, linked above, pointed out the technical hoops that needs to be jumped through to ensure backwards compatibility, and suggested solutions such as software emulation and supplying an additional chip within the new system, at the risk of driving up the launch cost, or at least driving down the margins of the new system out of the gate. While Nintendo has been incredibly successful at keeping the price of the Switch throughout this generation, the much more tepid launch of the 3DS showed that overstating the market's willingness to fork out for a console is risky, particularly if it's just to emulate games that can be played on a console most players already own. One option was for these new games to be individually ported and restored for the new console. This has advantages and disadvantages. It is costly, but the company may be able to pass that cost on through charging a conversion fee, perhaps one linked to a graphical update. This, though, potentially limits the games that might be ported over. You'd expect Mario Kart 8 Deluxe to make the jump because it's such a huge title, but what about games like Splatoon 2, which they might be keen to move on from to support the newer editions, or even games like Breath of the Wild, which offer the tantalizing potential for a fuller fat remake later on in the next console's life. Nintendo has remade a game that is already capable of being played on the same hardware at least once before when they produced Twilight Princess HD for Wii U, despite Twilight Princess being very readily available, and if the next system has a 7 or 8 year life cycle, this would be well past the roughly 10-year gap for a remaster we've seen for Wind Waker, Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword. If Nintendo appears to be gatekeeping some games, it could attract negative headlines at a sensitive time for their system launch. But it's also a headache for Nintendo to offer free upgrades on over 100 first-party titles. One solution I posited previously would be to put upgrades as a benefit of being a member of the online service, which allows Nintendo both to claim they still offer backwards compatibility while having a high degree of control over what they offer and when. On balance, some form of backwards compatibility seems to me to be a 90% certainty given their long history of offering that, but I'd put physical cartridges being backwards compatible without any kind of additional payment at only 70%, and at 50% I say they gate it behind the online system. For more on how Nintendo are developing their online infrastructure, check out the video on the screen, and in the meantime, thanks for watching and see you again for another Nintendo Forecast.